In the shadow of ancient empires, one apostle's faith was tested by fire and blade. Saint Bartholomew, a quiet disciple who carried the gospel across distant lands, was condemned for defying the gods of kings. His sentence was not swift death but the unspeakable agony of being flayed alive. Yet even as his flesh was torn, his final breath rose in prayer, unbroken. Bartholomew was, in many ways, the silent apostle. In the Gospels, his presence lingers in the background, often overshadowed by louder voices like Peter, John, or Thomas. Many scholars identify him with Nathanael, the man whom Jesus called an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. This simple description became a window into his soul, honest, unpretentious, and devoted. Yet despite his relative obscurity, Bartholomew stood among the 12, chosen not for fame, but for fidelity. He was there when Jesus broke bread and blessed the hungry crowds. He was there in the hushed moments, when the teacher prayed under starlit skies. He listened more than he spoke, absorbed more than he declared, and in that silence was a strength that would one day be tested to its breaking point. To understand Bartholomew is to understand the quiet power of hidden faith. His was not the faith that built thrones or thundered sermons to masses. It was the faith of presence, the unwavering companionship of a man who stood by his Lord without needing recognition. And that kind of faith is often the most enduring. In the culture of the first century, such a man would not have drawn attention. He was neither a philosopher nor a statesman, neither wealthy nor remarkable in appearance. What marked him was his willingness to follow Christ without question, leaving behind comfort and familiarity for a life of wandering uncertainty. Every step carried him farther from the safety of Galilee, into lands where the very name of Jesus was unknown. This obscurity has made Bartholomew a difficult figure for history to grasp. The Gospels mention him in lists, nothing more, but sometimes silence speaks louder than words. In an age where power was measured in marble monuments and royal decrees, here was a man who carried nothing but conviction. His legacy rests not in what he wrote, but in what he endured. It is perhaps fitting that the man who remained hidden in life became most remembered in death. The cruelty of his martyrdom would carve his name into history, searing his story into the memory of the Church. And yet, before that final moment, there was simply the quiet journey of a disciple who loved his teacher with a loyalty that neither time nor torment could break. Bartholomew's life reminds us that not every apostle needed to stand in the spotlight. Some carried the torch of faith in silence, illuminating dark corners of the world where few dared to go. It is in that obscurity, his hiddenness, that we see the paradox of God's work. The forgotten become unforgettable, and the quiet become eternal witnesses. After the resurrection of Christ, the world of the apostles shattered and expanded all at once. No longer bound to the hills of Galilee or the streets of Jerusalem, they were sent into the vast unknown, carrying with them only the memory of a crucified and risen Lord. For Bartholomew, this meant a journey into lands that few Jews of his time would ever see. Tradition speaks of him traveling eastward, into the cultural cross-currents of Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and Armenia. These were places steeped in ancient religions, where gods of stone and fire ruled the imagination of entire peoples. To walk into such places proclaiming a single God, unseen, intangible, yet incarnate in Jesus, was not merely strange. It was dangerous. Bartholomew walked with nothing but his faith and the scars of a fisherman's life. He had no wealth to buy favor, no political ties to shield him. His words were his only weapon, and even those were fragile against the tide of centuries-old traditions. Yet, one by one, villages listened. A few believed, and from those small sparks, communities began to gather around the message he preached. The journey was exhausting. Rivers to cross, mountains to climb, languages to decipher. At every turn, suspicion followed him. To some, he was a foreign wanderer. To others, a disturber of peace. Yet, Bartholomew pressed on. In each new town, he repeated the same story. A man who was God, who died, and who rose again. A story foolish to many, blasphemous to some, but life-changing to a few. One legend tells of him reaching India, where he left behind a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in the local tongue. Another claims he worked miracles in Armenia, casting out demons and healing the sick. Whether fact or legend, what matters is the image it leaves behind. A weary apostle, crossing cultural and linguistic chasms, carrying faith into places where it had never been spoken. These journeys were not triumphal marches. There were no parades, no royal welcomes. Often he was ignored, sometimes mocked, occasionally beaten. Yet Bartholomew seemed to understand something vital. The measure of an apostle was not in earthly success, but in faithfulness to the task. His mission was not to conquer, but to witness. Every step into foreign soil deepened the divide between him and his homeland. He would never again see the familiar waters of Galilee or the faces of his kin. His life became one long exile, lived for a kingdom not of this world, and with every mile, he walked closer to the destiny that awaited him. A death as brutal as his life had been faithful. Bartholomew's mission foreshadowed the cost of faith in a world resistant to change. The seeds he planted often fell on hostile ground, yet some took root. And like the grain of wheat that must die to bear fruit, Bartholomew's own life would soon be required as the final testimony of his message. Bartholomew's preaching did not remain hidden for long. The lands he entered were ruled by kings and priests whose power rested not only on armies but also on the sacred authority of idols. Temples dominated the skylines of their cities. Sacrifices filled their courtyards with smoke. Every chant, every ritual, was a thread binding society together. Into this delicate tapestry, Bartholomew cast a single word: Christ. At first, he was tolerated as a foreign wanderer. His strange stories of a crucified man-god were dismissed as harmless eccentricities. But soon, his message began to bite. When men who once bowed before stone idols turned away to follow this invisible god, the temple coffers grew lighter. When sick men were healed in the name of Jesus rather than through the intercession of local deities, priests felt their authority weaken. Whispers turned into accusations. This man insults the gods, he blasphemes our traditions, he defies the king himself. It was not merely religion that Bartholomew threatened. It was the entire social order. Pagan priests, fearing their altars would be abandoned, stirred unrest against him. Local rulers, guardians of both faith and law, saw in him not a prophet but a revolutionary. To preach monotheism in polytheistic lands was to ignite a fire against centuries of belief. Where the people saw gods in rivers, mountains, and stars, Bartholomew insisted there was only one God who created them all. His words sounded less like teaching and more like rebellion. In the ancient world, faith and politics were inseparable. An attack on one was an attack on the other. The clash was inevitable. Crowds that once listened with curiosity now grew restless. Stone-throwing mobs drove him from villages. Rumors spread that he practiced sorcery, that his miracles were tricks, that he sought to overthrow kings. The empire of idols, fragile but fiercely defended, had found its enemy. Yet Bartholomew did not soften his message. His faith, sharpened in obscurity, burned brighter under threat. He knew well that Christ had warned his followers, "If the world hates you, remember that it hated me first." To preach was to provoke. To confess was to court death. Still, he walked into city squares and spoke of a kingdom not built by human hands. In Armenia, tradition tells of King Polemius, whose household was said to be touched by Bartholomew's preaching. For a brief moment, the gospel entered royal halls. But influence invites scrutiny. When pagan priests realized the depth of his impact, they demanded retribution. The fragile balance between curiosity and hostility snapped. The king's advisors, fearful of losing their grip on the people, conspired to rid themselves of this foreign apostle once and for all. And so Bartholomew became more than a preacher, he became a threat. His very presence was a confrontation, his every word a challenge. The clash between truth and tradition, between faith and empire, could only end in violence. His obedience to Christ had carried him across deserts and rivers. Now it carried him into the jaws of power that would not let him go alive. The arrest was sudden, yet not unexpected. Bartholomew had seen the pattern before: curiosity, resistance, then fury. Soldiers dragged him through streets where only days before he had spoken of hope. Now the same people who had listened turned their eyes away, unwilling to be associated with a man condemned. He was hauled into the presence of rulers who demanded one thing: sacrifice. Not his life, at least not immediately, but his loyalty. Offer incense to the gods, they commanded. Pour wine at their altar. A single act, and you may live. It was the test all martyrs faced, the bargaining chip of empires. Renounce or die. Bartholomew's reply was simple and unwavering. He could not betray the God who had called him. To bend his knee to idols would be to betray not only Christ, but his very soul. In his silence, in his refusal, the courtroom became a battlefield of conviction. The rulers held power over his body. He held power over his conscience. Neither would yield. The accusations piled on him: sorcery, treason, blasphemy. Witnesses, bribed or threatened, testified against him. Yet beneath the legal veneer, the trial was never about evidence, it was about intimidation. A foreign man, standing alone, defying kings and gods alike, this was a spectacle meant to crush his resolve. But Bartholomew's composure unsettled them. He did not plead, he did not curse. He answered only with prayers, with quiet words of witness. To the authorities, his calmness was an insult, his serenity an act of rebellion. They wanted fear, he gave faith. They wanted submission, he gave defiance, clothed in gentleness. The verdict was inevitable. He was guilty not of crime, but of refusing to bend. And so, the rulers pronounced his fate. Not a swift sword, not a merciful strike. They sought a death that would terrify, a punishment so grotesque it would erase all memory of his preaching. To flay him alive was not only execution, it was humiliation, a theater of cruelty designed to break both man and message. As he was led back to prison, the sentence echoing in the air, Bartholomew prayed. His body trembled, but his soul was at peace. He had followed Christ across lands unknown. Now he would follow him into death. To the world, his trial ended in condemnation. To him, it ended in victory. For faith that survives the courtroom is faith already crowned. In the silence of his cell, awaiting dawn, he whispered not of despair but of hope. He knew the verdict was final. Yet in that certainty lay freedom, the freedom to die as he had lived, steadfast and unbroken. The judges had condemned his flesh, but they could not touch the spirit that already belonged to eternity. The sentence handed down to Bartholomew was not chosen at random. To his accusers, a simple execution would be far too merciful. They wanted to create a spectacle, a warning that would echo through the streets and silence any who dared follow his teachings. Thus, they condemned him to flaying, a punishment that stripped away not just the body but the dignity of the victim. Flaying was among the most horrifying executions of the ancient world. Unlike a swift strike of the sword or the crushing blow of stones, it was designed for maximum suffering. Skin, the body's natural armor, would be peeled away while life still pulsed beneath. To order such a death was to declare that the condemned was less than human, reduced to an object of mockery, a grotesque display for the crowd. For Bartholomew, this was not merely a sentence of death, it was an assault on his very identity. The rulers wanted to erase him, to turn his body into a lesson in terror. They believed that by desecrating his flesh, they could discredit his faith. If the apostle who preached eternal life could be humiliated so utterly, perhaps others would abandon the path he proclaimed. Yet the cruelty of the sentence only magnified the contrast with Bartholomew's calm. Accounts describe him neither begging nor cursing. Instead, he accepted the verdict as though it were another step on his journey. For him, death was not an interruption but a passage, a narrow gate leading to the presence of the God he served. The sentence was proclaimed publicly. Messengers spread word of the upcoming execution, ensuring that a crowd would gather. The authorities wanted witnesses. They wanted fear. Children would hear of the fate of the Christian preacher. Parents would warn their households never to follow his path. The memory of his agony would serve as a chain stronger than any prison. But history often twists the intentions of the powerful. What was meant as a theater of despair became, over centuries, a theater of inspiration. Artists would later depict Bartholomew holding his own flayed skin as a symbol of endurance. His grotesque death would become one of the most enduring images of martyrdom, transforming horror into testimony. Still, in the moment, there was only the looming terror of what awaited him. As soldiers led him back to his cell, perhaps he felt the weight of his humanity, the instinct to recoil, the body's natural dread of pain. Yet his faith anchored him. "Fear not those who kill the body," Christ had said, "but cannot kill the soul." This was the scripture he carried like a shield. To the authorities, the sentence was victory. To Bartholomew, it was confirmation that he had indeed followed in the footsteps of his master. Jesus himself had been humiliated, stripped, and crucified. Now his disciple would drink from the same cup. Death was not defeat, it was imitation. And so the stage was set. The instruments of cruelty were prepared. The crowd was summoned, and the condemned apostle awaited the dawn. What remained was not a question of if, but of how he would meet it. Would he break? Would he curse? Or would he remain the silent witness, testifying even in agony? His response would define not only his death, but his legacy. The prison cell was cold and bare, yet within its silence, Bartholomew found the final sanctuary of his earthly life. Night had fallen, and the city beyond the walls slept in uneasy peace. For the apostle, however, this was the eve of his execution, the last hours before agony would claim his body. Tradition tells us that he prayed through the night. His words were not of despair, but of surrender. He prayed for strength, for the believers who would be left behind, for those who persecuted him, and even for the rulers who had condemned him. In this paradoxical love lay the essence of his faith: to bless those who cursed, to forgive those who inflicted pain. Within the darkness, he may have recalled the faces of his fellow apostles: Peter, who would be crucified upside down; Thomas, who would fall to spears in India; James, slain by Herod's sword. One by one, the 12 were scattering like seeds into the soil of history, each watered by their blood. His turn had come. He was not alone, for the path of martyrdom was shared. The cell, though silent, pulsed with memory. He remembered the Galilean shore where he first heard Christ's call. He remembered the miracles, the parables, the breaking of bread. He remembered the moment after the resurrection when doubt gave way to joy. These memories wrapped him like a cloak, shielding him from the dread of what tomorrow would bring. To the guards, he may have seemed strangely at peace. They had seen prisoners weep, beg, or rage. Bartholomew did none of these. His serenity unsettled them, for it was not the resignation of despair but the composure of one who already lived beyond fear. It was as though he had already stepped into eternity, and the execution awaiting him was but a doorway. For the believers who managed to visit, his words were consolation. "Do not be afraid," he might have said. "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. My suffering will not end this faith. It will spread it." To hear such words from a man facing unspeakable torment was both heartbreaking and inspiring. It reminded them that the kingdom they belonged to was not of this world. As the night deepened, the city stirred restlessly. Priests prepared the instruments of ritual, soldiers sharpened their blades, and rumor spread through the alleys of what tomorrow would bring. Yet in the prison cell, there was only the rhythm of prayer. Every whispered psalm, every sigh, was a step closer to heaven. The apostle's body trembled, but his soul stood firm. He knew that dawn would not bring deliverance, but death. And yet, for him, that death was deliverance. Beyond the cruelty of men lay the promise of Christ: "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Thus, the final night of Bartholomew was not a night of terror, but of preparation. It was a vigil, a waiting, a sacred pause before the storm. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks of his cell, it did not find a man broken by fear. It found a witness ready to seal his testimony with blood. The morning broke heavy with anticipation. Crowds gathered in the square, drawn by rumors of the gruesome spectacle promised by the rulers. Men, women, and even children came, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The execution site was prepared like a stage, for flaying was not done in secrecy. It was meant to be seen, to terrify, to crush the spirit of those who might dare follow the condemned man's path. Bartholomew was led into the open air, his chains clinking against the stones. His body bore the marks of imprisonment, but his face carried a serenity that unnerved even his captors. To the onlookers, he did not appear like a man defeated, but like one walking into a destiny already accepted. His eyes, calm and resolute, looked not at the crowd but upward, as though seeking strength from a realm unseen. The executioners were seasoned men, accustomed to cruelty. Yet even they hesitated for a moment, for to flay a man alive was an ordeal, not only for the victim, but for those who performed it. It demanded endurance, precision, and a merciless heart. When the first blade touched his skin, the crowd gasped, and a hush fell over the square. What followed was agony beyond comprehension. The pain was not a sudden strike, but a slow unraveling of the body itself. Each cut, each pull, was meant to prolong suffering, to stretch life into torture. Yet Bartholomew did not scream as expected. His lips moved, not in curses, but in prayer. The psalms of his childhood, the words of Christ, rose from him like a hymn carried on bloodied breath. Some in the crowd turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned in, drawn by the terrible fascination of a man, enduring what seemed unendurable. Mothers shielded the eyes of their children, but the memory of that day would linger in every heart present. The rulers, watching from their seats of authority, expected to see fear, pleading, collapse. Instead, they saw defiance, silent, steadfast, radiant. The executioners continued, their hands stained, their brows furrowed, for the victim before them was not breaking as men usually did. Each wound became a testimony, each moment of agony a proclamation louder than any sermon. Bartholomew's body was unraveling, but his spirit seemed only to grow stronger. The spectacle, intended to disgrace, began to transform. The crowd, instead of laughing, grew uneasy. The ruler's attempt to make an example of him was backfiring. Here was a man robbed of everything, yet still unbroken. The brutality did not silence him. It amplified his witness. And so the torture dragged on, the square echoing with the clash of blade against flesh, the murmur of horrified whispers, and above it all, the prayers of a dying apostle. What should have been a display of power became instead a revelation of weakness of rulers terrified by a faith they could not kill. In that moment, the flaying of Bartholomew became more than execution. It became the theater of truth, where cruelty revealed its impotence, and faith revealed its unshakable strength. At last, the human body reached its limit. No matter the strength of the spirit, flesh can endure only so much. Bartholomew, weakened by hours of torment, staggered under the weight of his own suffering. His breathing grew shallow, his voice faltered, but his eyes, those eyes, remained fixed on heaven. As his executioners pressed on, perhaps frustrated that he still lived, the crowd could sense the end drawing near. Silence fell again, thick and heavy, as though the entire city held its breath. And in that silence, the apostle whispered one final prayer. Words of surrender, words of forgiveness, words that carried him beyond the reach of pain. Then, like a candle flickering out, his life departed, his body slumped, bloodied, and broken, into the dust. The ground beneath him was stained red, but to those who watched with hearts open, it seemed as though the earth itself had been consecrated. His death, horrific in form, became holy in meaning. The rulers saw only a corpse, a problem solved. They believed his humiliation complete, his memory erased by horror. Yet even as his body lay lifeless, a strange power lingered. The very people who had come to be entertained by cruelty left in silence, shaken by what they had witnessed. No one could forget the sight of a man meeting such death with peace. For the Christians who gathered secretly, his death was not defeat, but victory. They risked their lives to recover his remains, to honor him as a martyr. In whispered hymns and hidden gatherings, they spoke of Bartholomew not as a victim, but as a witness who had conquered the fear of death. The image of his martyrdom spread, carried from mouth to mouth, city to city. The story of the apostle who was flayed alive yet died in prayer became a beacon. Where rulers intended to sow fear, they instead planted faith. His blood, spilled upon foreign soil, watered the seeds of Christianity in lands that once rejected it. Centuries later, artists and sculptors would capture the moment in haunting images. Bartholomew, holding his own skin, his face serene, his faith intact. These works, though grotesque, testify to a paradox that what man meant for horror, God turned into glory. In the end, Bartholomew's death was not a tragedy of defeat, but a triumph of witness. His tormentors stripped away his flesh, but they could not strip away his faith. His last breath was not despair but devotion, and in that moment, a silent apostle became an eternal voice, echoing across ages, calling all who suffer to endure with hope. Thus ended the earthly life of Bartholomew, not with applause, not with honor, but with agony transformed into testimony. A disciple who had lived in quiet faith, died in roaring witness, leaving behind not just a story of death, but a legacy of life eternal. When Bartholomew's body finally gave out, those who loved him faced a dangerous choice. To claim the remains of a condemned man was to risk sharing his fate. Yet the early Christians knew that martyrs were not simply victims, they were seeds, and their blood was nourishment for faith. Quietly, in the shadows of night, they gathered what was left of him, wrapping the body with reverence, as though tending not to a corpse, but to a relic. For them, his flayed flesh was not a sight of horror but a testimony. The very punishment meant to disgrace him now spoke of unbreakable faith. The skin that had been torn from his bones became a paradoxical symbol. Humiliation transformed into sanctity. It was fitting, perhaps, that he would later be remembered as the patron saint of tanners and leather workers, those whose craft involved the stripping of hides. What had been his torment became, in faith, a kind of sanctified reversal. Stories of his martyrdom spread across Armenia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Pilgrims whispered of miracles at his tomb, healings that occurred when believers prayed in his name. Bit by bit, his memory refused to die. The rulers who had tried to silence him had instead created a symbol too powerful to erase. His suffering etched itself into Christian consciousness, not as defeat, but as proof that faith could withstand even the most unthinkable cruelty. Centuries later, when the Church sought to inspire the faithful, artists turned to Bartholomew's image. Painters depicted him with his flayed skin draped over his arm, his face calm, his body scarred yet transfigured. Michelangelo, in his Last Judgment, placed Bartholomew at the very heart of heaven's drama, his empty skin held like a banner of triumph. The grotesque became glorious, and what once was spectacle of despair became spectacle of hope. For ordinary believers, the story of Bartholomew offered both terror and comfort. Terror, because it revealed the depths to which rulers would descend to protect their idols. Comfort, because it proved that the soul could outlast the destruction of the body. Each retelling became a reminder: what is torn in flesh can still remain whole in spirit. As relics of Bartholomew were carried westward, devotion to him spread across Europe. Churches rose in his name. His feast day was celebrated, his relics venerated, his image carved into stone and painted onto wood. Wherever his story traveled, it reminded believers that their faith was built not only on doctrines, but on blood willingly shed for truth. In this transformation, we see the strange alchemy of martyrdom. The rulers thought they had ended Bartholomew by flaying his flesh. Instead, they had unveiled his immortality. His broken body became a symbol stronger than any empire, one that endured long after kings and temples crumbled. Thus the apostle who was once obscure in the Gospels became unforgettable in history. His silence in life was overshadowed by the thunder of his death. From mere flesh, a symbol was born, an image that would endure as long as faith itself. The legacy of Saint Bartholomew is not written in books he composed or sermons he delivered. It is written in the endurance of his body, the serenity of his soul, and the witness of his death. He reminds us that faith is not always measured in victories but in perseverance, standing firm when the world seeks to strip you of everything. For centuries, his story has been told and retold, not to glorify cruelty, but to magnify faith. The Church remembers him not as a man defeated, but as a man transfigured. In every retelling, Bartholomew speaks silently across time. Do not fear those who destroy the body, fear instead the loss of the soul. His words, though unrecorded, echo in the testimony of his martyrdom. In art and devotion, he stands as one of the most striking figures of martyrdom. Unlike other apostles, whose deaths are remembered in simpler strokes, Bartholomew's is carved in vivid, almost unbearable detail. Yet it is precisely that detail, the unbearable cruelty, that gives his witness such power. He endured what most could not imagine, and in doing so, he proved that the spirit can transcend even the worst darkness. His patronage over leather workers, butchers, and tanners reflects the strange irony of his death. Professions that dealt with skin found in him a protector, a saint who had himself been stripped of his. What once was his humiliation became his glory, and what once was his suffering became a source of intercession for generations. But beyond patronages and relics, his true legacy lies in the courage he inspires. In times of persecution, Christians looked to Bartholomew and remembered that cruelty has its limits, but faith does not. In the darkest hours of history, whether under Roman emperors, medieval tyrants, or modern oppressors, his story has been invoked to remind the faithful that pain passes, but truth endures. Today, in a world far removed from the brutality of flaying, his life still speaks. It tells us that dignity does not depend on circumstances, that a man can be stripped of everything, even his skin, and yet remain unbroken. That the measure of faith is not in what it avoids, but in what it withstands. His death also poses a challenge. It asks us, what do we cling to when everything else is taken away? For Bartholomew, the answer was clear. He clung to Christ, even when the cost was agony. His example stands as both a comfort and a provocation, calling us to examine the depth of our own convictions. The empires that killed him are gone, their temples lie in ruins, their gods forgotten. But Bartholomew endures. His name is spoken in prayers, his feast celebrated on altars, his image carved in stone. He is proof that power built on cruelty is fleeting, but witness built on truth is eternal. In the end, the apostle who began as a quiet disciple became one of the loudest voices of faith. Through his martyrdom, he declared what words could never fully capture, that the soul of a believer cannot be flayed. His blood became seed, his body became symbol, and his death became life for generations to come. And so, centuries later, we remember not the cruelty of his executioners, but the courage of his endurance. Saint Bartholomew's legacy is simple yet profound. Kingdoms rise and fall, bodies decay, but faith lived unto death remains immortal.